September 12th, 1942. Guadalcanal. Night had only just settled over the jungle when Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, stood on a narrow coral ridge 1 mile south of Henderson Field and listened to the darkness. Down in the black wall of trees below him, 3,000 Japanese infantry were sliding into position. He could not see them, but he could hear everything. Branches snapping under boots, the metallic clink of rifles and ammunition boxes, shouted orders in Japanese that did not even try to be quiet. They were that sure of themselves. Behind Edson, scattered along the crest and slopes of the ridge, were 840 exhausted Marines, raiders and paratroopers who had been fighting, marching and digging for more than a month. Many were running on 2 meals a day. Malaria, dysentery, and jungle rot had stripped weight from their bodies and strength from their arms. Some had not slept in 36 hours. Their uniforms were stiff with sweat and mud, their boots never truly dry. The ridge under their boots was the last decent high ground before the airstrip. If the Japanese took it, their artillery could pound Henderson Field into rubble. The handful of aircraft that kept Guadalcanal supplied and defended by day would be destroyed on the ground. Once the planes were gone, the 12,000 Marines around the airfield would be isolated on an island that the enemy controlled by sea and sky. Edson knew all of this, and so did his men. Everything came down to one strip of coral and kunai grass. He did not give them a speech about glory or destiny. He moved quietly from foxhole to foxhole, crouching beside small groups of Marines in the dark, telling them the only thing that mattered: hold tonight, just hold one more night. If we are still here in the morning, we will be relieved. It was not inspiration, it was a deadline. Survive until dawn and the line might hold. Break before dawn and Guadalcanal would probably be lost. To understand why that night mattered, you have to understand how the world looked in the summer of 1942. Japan was not simply on the offensive, it looked unbeatable. In the 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia faster than almost any planner in London or Washington had believed possible. Hong Kong had fallen in 17 days. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore, garrisoned by tens of thousands of British and Commonwealth troops, had surrendered in 10 weeks, the largest capitulation in British military history. The Dutch East Indies, with their vital oil fields, had collapsed in 3 months. Burma had fallen. The Philippines had fallen after a heroic but hopeless stand. On map after map, flags with the red rising sun spread outward in every direction. Japanese strategists in Tokyo calculated that the empire now controlled a resource base larger than the home islands had ever dreamed of. Oil from the Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, metals and labor from newly conquered territories. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was no longer just a slogan. Even more dangerous than new territory was a new kind of confidence. From Shanghai to Singapore, Japanese commanders had watched Western forces crumble. British soldiers had surrendered by the tens of thousands, many without firing a shot. American and Filipino units on Bataan had fought fiercely, but eventually starved, bombed and shelled into collapse. The Japanese officer corps convinced itself that the pattern was clear. Westerners were materially rich but spiritually weak. Japanese troops, shaped by the Bushido warrior ethic, were tougher, more disciplined, and more willing to die. In staff studies and briefing papers, Japanese analysts insisted that one Japanese infantryman was worth 10 Americans. Marines were even described in some reports as criminals, given a choice between prison and service, unreliable under pressure, and quick to panic once casualties mounted. When Imperial headquarters estimated the forces around Henderson Field, they assumed there were perhaps 2,000 Marines, hungry, demoralized, poorly supplied. The reality was more than 12,000 well-trained riflemen and gunners who had no intention of leaving. Major General Alexander van de Grift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, understood the truth better than either Tokyo or Washington. His men had landed on Guadalcanal on August 7th with roughly 17 days of ammunition and rations. Then the Navy, hammered by Japanese air attacks and night surface actions, had pulled away. The Marines were left holding a half-finished airfield on an island whose interior they barely understood. facing an enemy who controlled the surrounding seas. Japanese aircraft bombed the area almost daily. Japanese cruisers and destroyers slipped down the slot at night, shelling the perimeter and then racing away before dawn.
Every week, fresh enemy troops arrived in destroyer runs. The Marines bitterly nicknamed the Tokyo Express. Food was short, medical supplies were short, sleep was short, but fire discipline and training were not. The Japanese intelligence officers who pictured the Marines as undisciplined brawlers could not have been more wrong. Marine boot camp lasted 13 weeks, longer than any other American service. Every recruit spent more than 100 hours on the rifle range before qualifying. Every Marine a rifleman was not a slogan for posters. It was the stubborn reality of their training schedule. By 1942, Marine marksmanship scores were legendary. An Army soldier who shot well enough to be awarded an expert badge would barely scrape through Marine qualification. On top of that, the Corps had spent the interwar years obsessing over one question: how do you land on a hostile beach and stay there? Since the 1930s, they had practiced amphibious landings with the fleet, written tentative manuals, argued over landing craft designs, and rehearsed air-ground cooperation. Those dry doctrinal debates in classrooms and on remote beaches would soon decide who lived and who died on a jungle ridge no one in Washington had cared about 6 months earlier. The Japanese were about to discover that the convict Marines on Guadalcanal were anything but soft. The first shock came not on Edson's Ridge but 2 weeks earlier at the mouth of a small river, mislabeled on American maps as the Tenaru. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki, leading just under 1,000 elite infantry, landed with orders to drive the invaders into the sea in a single night attack. His man had fought in China many had never tasted defeat. They marched toward the Marine perimeter certain that another panicked Western retreat awaited them. They found something different. As darkness fell on August 21st, Ichiki's battalion reached the sandbar at the river mouth. They fixed bayonets, formed up shoulder to shoulder, and charged across the open ground, shouting and firing as they ran. This was the formula that had broken Chinese armies and British garrisons: shock, speed, and absolute indifference to death. For a moment the night was full of their voices. Then the Marines opened fire. Machine guns that had been patiently registered on the crossing points stitched the sandbar from 3 directions. Tracer rounds slashed through the tightly packed ranks. Riflemen who had spent weeks on the range fired steadily, not in blind panic but in deliberate, practiced rhythm. Mortars dropped shells along the riverbank. The first wave of Japanese infantry disintegrated. The second wave climbed over bodies and was cut down and turned. The third wave crawled, tried to dig into the sand, and died under the same crossing fire. By dawn, the river mouth looked unreal. Hundreds of Japanese bodies lay tangled in the surf and on the sandbar. M3 Stuart light tanks clanked forward through coconut palms, crushing abandoned equipment as they finished off pockets of resistance in the groves beyond. Out of roughly 900 attackers, more than 800 were dead. Colonel Ichiki burned his regimental colors and shot himself rather than report such a disaster. American losses were 35 killed. When news of the engagement reached Tokyo, many staff officers simply refused to believe the numbers. A handful of machine guns and a thin line of infantry could not possibly have annihilated an elite battalion. Reports were filed away as exaggerations or mistakes. The easier explanation was that Ichiki had been reckless and unlucky. The doctrine itself, the belief that Japanese willpower could smash American positions, regardless of terrain or firepower, remained untouched. Guadalcanal would not let that illusion survive for long. Reinforcements kept coming down the slot. Destroyers unloaded fresh units who marched inland along jungle trails, convinced they would succeed where Ichiki had failed. One of the officers waiting for them was Edson, whose raider battalion had already earned a reputation for sudden, aggressive patrols. On the maps, his new defensive line was just another contour. To the man who would fight there, it was simply the ridge. It was an awkward piece of ground for a stand, long, narrow, and shaped like a dogleg, with uneven slopes and limited room to deploy. But it lay directly on the most obvious jungle approach to Henderson Field. If the Japanese were going to strike hard at the airfield from inland, they almost had to come that way. Vandegrift understood this. So did Edson. They packed what strength they had onto the ridge and waited for the next test of whether American infantry could stand against the Empire that believed itself invincible. On the evening of September 12th, with flares from offshore warships flickering on the horizon and the jungle below crawling with unseen men, Edson listened and decided that what came his raiders would not be the ones to break. Japanese preparations for the assault on the ridge began long before the Marines ever heard the first snap branch below them. Major General Kyoto Kawaguchi, leading roughly 3,000 troops from what had once been one of Japan's best brigades, had spent weeks fighting through some of the worst jungle terrain on the island. Dense bamboo groves, razor-sharp kunai grass, ravines choked with vines and mud that swallowed boots to the ankles slowed his advance to a crawl. His men hacked through the green darkness with machetes and bayonets, hauling artillery by hand, eating half-rotted rice and losing dozens to malaria before they ever fired a shot. But their confidence never wavered. After all, every prior encounter with Western troops had ended the same way. Japan victorious, the enemy broken. Kawaguchi believed the coming assault would be no different. He had studied the map carefully. The ridge was narrow, the American perimeter thin, their numbers small. A concentrated night attack, the trademark Japanese tactic, would overwhelm them, seize the high ground, and leave Henderson Field exposed. The moment the airstrip fell, Japan could pour artillery fire onto the runway and destroy the aircraft that kept the Marines alive. To him, the entire campaign pivoted on that single ridge. Take it, and Guadalcanal would collapse like Singapore and Batam before it. But the Japanese were not the only ones preparing. Edson had spent the entire afternoon walking the line, correcting firing positions, adjusting fields of fire, and speaking quietly to platoon leaders. His instincts told him that the Japanese attack would come exactly where it finally did. A funnel of kunai grass leading straight up the dogleg curve of the ridge. He had fought in Nicaragua, commanded raiders on surprise operations, and seen men break under pressure. But he had also seen what Marines were capable of when properly led. He told his officers one thing repeatedly: "We hold here, or we lose the island." No one needed further explanation. At 9:30 p.m., the night split open. A Japanese cruiser offshore fired the first salvo. Seconds later, destroyers joined in, their shells crashing into the ridge like falling meteors. Marines clung to the ground as coral fragments ripped through the dark, each explosion throwing dirt and branches into the air. Edson knew this bombardment well. It was a curtain, a prelude to infantry rushing in immediately afterward. When the shelling lifted, the sounds began again. Hundreds of footsteps shouted commands in Japanese, steel scraping against steel. The muted thump of mortars being fired from somewhere deep in the trees. The first wave surged out of the jungle. They came in a long, uneven line, silhouettes against the faint starlight, yelling as they charged up the slope with bayonets fixed. Marine machine guns opened instantly. Single shots at first, then long bursts that stitched across the grass. Tracers carved red arcs through the darkness. The leading Japanese fell, replaced by those behind them, who stepped over the bodies and kept climbing. The air filled with the shriek of bullets, the thump of grenades, and the sound of men screaming orders in English and Japanese. But the Japanese kept coming. Wave after wave hurled itself against the ridge, sometimes climbing so close that Marines could hear the breath of attackers before seeing them. One platoon of paratroopers, hit hardest, began to buckle. Their commander fell with a shot through the chest. A gap opened. Exactly what the Japanese had been waiting for. A wedge of infantry poured into it, driving toward the airfield only a few hundred meters beyond. Edson saw it immediately. He sprinted toward the collapsing center, bullets snapping past him. Climbing onto an ammunition crate, in full view of the enemy, he shouted orders over the roar of battle, directing machine guns and calling artillery coordinates on a field phone. His men later said that seeing their commander standing upright in the open, refusing to duck even as tracers passed inches from his legs, steadied them more than any speech could have. The line stiffened. Marines who had been falling back turned and went forward again. Still, the Japanese kept pushing. At one point, a group of enemy soldiers nearly reached the final rise of the ridge. Marines Marines met them hand to hand. Bayonets clashed in the dark, knives flashed, rifle butts cracked against helmets. Some men fought with entrenching tools when their rifles jammed with mud. The grass was so tall, and the night so absolute, that friend and foe collided almost blindly. One raider later wrote that the only way he recognized Japanese soldiers was by the rhythm of their footsteps and the sound of their breathing. By 2 a.m., the line hung by a thread. Edson and his officers ordered a controlled withdrawal 30 to 40 yards back to a tighter, more defensible line. They moved quietly, dragging wounded with them, resetting machine guns, and reforming squads by flashlight covered with cloth to dim the glow. The Japanese, thinking they had broken through, surged forward again. Instead, they ran straight into new fields of fire. Machine guns erupted. Mortars dropped shells into the darkness. The momentum shifted. Then came the moment that turned the entire battle. The 11th Marines, the division's artillery, had registered their guns onto the approaches the previous afternoon. Now, with Edson's shouted coordinates relayed through runners and radios, they unleashed mission after mission. The ridge below exploded in continuous flashes, as 105mm shells tore through the tightly packed Japanese infantry. The blasts rolled through the jungle like thunder. Men were thrown into the air. Entire squads disappeared in smoke and fire. For the first time in the night, the Japanese attack faltered. By 3 a.m., Kawaguchi's assault columns were disorganized, shredded by artillery and unable to push through the reorganized Marine line. Officers tried to rally their men for one last banzai thrust, but the density of explosions made any movement impossible. Marines, exhausted and nearly out of ammunition, held stubbornly. Some fired their last rounds and then waited with knives and grenades for whatever might come next. What came instead was silence. As dawn crept over the ridge, the Marines saw the battlefield for the first time. Bodies lay everywhere, in the kunai grass, tangled among fallen tree limbs, slumped against shattered logs. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers had died only yards from the Marine foxholes. In total, more than 600 enemy dead would be counted. Many more had crawled or been dragged into the jungle before daylight. Marine casualties were fewer than 200. The men who had survived the night looked at one another with disbelief. They were starving, feverish, sleep-deprived, half-rotted by humidity, and they had stopped an attack 3 times their size. They had faced shock tactics that had crushed armies across Asia, yet the line had held exactly as Edson had demanded. But the consequences reached far beyond the ridge. Word spread quickly among the surviving Japanese. American Marines were not like the British at Singapore or the Dutch in Java. These men did not break. They did not surrender. They fired with deadly accuracy, coordinated artillery with terrifying precision, and counterattacked even when outnumbered 3 to 1. A myth had been shattered. The myth that Western infantry could not stand against the Imperial Japanese Army. In diaries recovered after the war, Japanese officers admitted something they would never have said publicly in 1942. Their firepower defeated us. We put too much belief in the charge. Another wrote, "We thought they were 2,000 men. They were 12,000. Intelligence was wrong in everything." Guadalcanal had sent its first clear message. Japan's spiritual superiority was not enough. America's supposed softness was an illusion, and the United States Marine Corps was about to become the most feared ground force Japan would ever face. In Tokyo, the shockwaves from the defeats at the Tenaru and Edson's Ridge did not spread instantly. Japanese high command was too deeply invested in its own assumptions to accept the truth. Reports flowing back from Guadalcanal described catastrophic losses, but staff officers dismissed them as exaggerations or failures of individual commanders. They reasoned that Ichiki had been reckless, charging across open ground with only half his regiment. They reasoned that Kawaguchi's brigade had been worn down by the jungle and disease before its assault. They clung to the belief that Japanese infantry, fueled by spiritual strength, was still superior to anything the Americans could feel. But among officers who had actually seen the battlefield, the truth could not be ignored. Lieutenant Genjiro Inui, whose diary would later provide historians with one of the clearest window into Japanese perceptions, wrote after surveying the carnage at the Tenaru, "We had too much confidence in our charging power. Their firepower was was beyond expectation. After Edson's ridge, he added another line, one that perfectly captured Japan's growing confusion. We believed the Marines numbered 2,000. They were 12,000. Intelligence was wrong in all matters. He had no idea how right he was, and how much worse things were about to get. While Japanese officers struggled to reconcile their expectations with reality, the Marines on Guadalcanal dug in deeper. Their victory at Edson's Ridge did not mean safety. The Tokyo Express continued delivering reinforcements every few nights. Japanese artillery shelled the airfield constantly. Snipers harassed work crews repairing the runway. Malaria ran through the ranks like wildfire. Men were losing weight so rapidly that commanders worried they might collapse, even before engaging in combat. Some Marines survived on fewer than 2 meals a day, others simply chewed coffee grounds to stay awake during night watch. But something had changed. Morale had surged. Marines who had doubted whether they could withstand a full Japanese assault now knew they could. They had defeated an elite brigade in the darkness, at close range, outnumbered 3-1. They did not underestimate the Japanese. They respected the enemy's courage and tenacity, but they no longer feared them in the same way. Japan, meanwhile, still believed one final massive blow could retake the island. That blow came in late October. The battle for Henderson Field, the largest Japanese ground assault of the entire campaign. Lieutenant General Harukichi Haikutaki, commanding the 17th Army, assembled roughly 20,000 troops for a multi-pronged offensive designed to crush the Marine and Army defensive perimeter. Unlike Ichiki and Kawaguchi, Haikutaki planned a coordinated attack with artillery, naval bombardment, and infantry advancing from several directions. Japanese battleships Kongo and Haruna opened the assault on October 13, with one of the most violent naval bombardments in the entire Pacific War. For nearly 90 minutes, they fired 14-inch shells onto Henderson Field, lighting the night sky with explosions that Marines later described as hell on Earth. The bombardment destroyed half the aviation fuel on the island, destroyed aircraft, and turned the airfield into a cratered wasteland. Japanese commanders believed no defending force could recover from such punishment. They were wrong. By dawn, Seabees and Marine engineers were already filling craters, clearing debris, and coaxing surviving aircraft into the air. Pilots flew with their fuel tanks half full because there was no fuel to spare. Mechanics cannibalized wrecked planes to keep a handful operational. The Cactus Air Force, the ragged, exhausted group of pilots defending the island, refused to die. This resilience stunned Japanese planners, who had expected the airfield to be out of operation for at least several days. But the ground assault was coming, and it would be even worse. Haikutaki's 20,000 troops attacked in 3 main thrusts. 2 divisions pushed toward the Matanakawa River on the western side, hoping to crush the perimeter and roll up the defenses. The main blow, however, came from the south, through jungle so dense that some Japanese units lost hundreds of men to exhaustion, even before contact with the Marines. The assault began on October 24th. Japanese infantry poured from the trees in tightly packed formations, attempting to overwhelm the Army regiments holding the southern line. But the Americans were ready. Marine and Army machine gunners waited until the last possible second before opening fire. Darkness swallowed muzzle flashes. Mortars pummeled the jungle. Artillery from the 11th Marines lit the night like lightning. The Japanese charged again, and again, and again. Some units reached the American barbed wire. Some crawled under it. Some launched desperate bayonet attacks into the machine gun belts. But the same pattern seen at the Tenaru and Edson's Ridge repeated itself. Japanese bravery met American firepower and broke. By the end of the battle, roughly 3,500 Japanese soldiers lay dead outside the perimeter. American ground casualties were fewer than 300. To the Japanese survivors, the realization was devastating. Their most determined, coordinated, and reinforced assault of the entire Guadalcanal campaign had failed. Their soldiers had not lacked courage. They had charged at machine guns in the dark, climbed over their own dead, and fought with fanaticism. But courage alone could not overcome the combination of Marine marksmanship, American artillery, and well-prepared defensive positions. The myth of spiritual superiority was dying. and it was dying fast. Hyakutake withdrew what remained of his battered forces into the jungle. Thousands more would die in the coming weeks from starvation, malaria, and disease. The Tokyo Express could deliver troops but not food. Japan's logistical system, built for quick wars and rapid advances, was collapsing. Meanwhile, American strength on the island grew daily. Reinforcements landed. Artillery increased. The Cactus Air Force regained control of the skies, and the Marines, who had once been desperate and outnumbered, now held the initiative. By early 1943, Japan made the decision it had avoided for months. They evacuated Guadalcanal. In total, the Japanese had landed 36,000 troops on the island. They lost somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 to combat starvation and disease. American killed in action for the entire campaign would number around 1,600. The ratios were staggering and unprecedented in modern warfare. Guadalcanal became a turning point not only because of the strategic value of the island, but because it shattered the psychological foundation of the Japanese army. For a decade, they had triumphed in China and Southeast Asia, winning through shock aggression and an unwavering belief in the superiority of the Japanese fighting spirit. Now, that belief lay broken in the humid jungles and coral ridges of Guadalcanal. But the war was far from over. Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa still awaited, and each would demand more from both sides. Each would force new adaptations. Each would push the U.S. Marine Corps to perfect a style of fighting that Japan could not match, and at the center of all these battles stood the same lesson revealed on a ridge south of Henderson Field. American infantry, properly trained, well-led, and supported by overwhelming firepower, could survive anything Japan threw at them, and more importantly, they could win.